Not sure if I can meet this introduction, so you'll have to figure out. Okay, Marcus said I write everything down. So I start with that. I rewrote the lecture notes, and you get a file somehow through your magic channels. So that's there as a PDF. I usually have typing errors, so if you find them, enjoy them. That's it, basically. Then I will use a lot of PowerPoint, and the file is there as well, so you have that too. If somebody needs it as a PDF, you can let me know, and then I can turn it into a PDF as well. Yeah. Is that okay? All right. Yeah. Okay, so who am I? I have been introduced, so I'm not sure if I should repeat, but some of the things that Kusi didn't mention. So the name is HEINZ, which is a typical Swiss name that nobody knows, so it's not very spread. I was born in 1959, which makes me turning 64. I should adjust my file here. Okay, so I'm in YWAM, did a DTS in 1980, and I've been working with YWAM after that, first in the UK, and then we started here in the area, and that I was part of the team starting the base here. Involved when you start a base, of course, is always leading DTSs. There is no way around that. And then in '92, after some time in different areas of YWAM, I changed to SBS and developed something which we call the BSBS, which is a bi-weekly course on Bible study. And that's running off base for the last 22 years or so. So long time in Bible study. I also did quite a bit of media work, was trained in mechanical engineering, communication, and radio and TV production. So there were different things that I did. I like technical stuff. So I think that's a leftover that I carry on. I'm married since '87. My wife Anita, she is working in the same hospital as Nadia. Not hospital, retirement home. Yeah. So and we live up there actually not because we are old, but because she's working there. Just to clarify that. Okay. We have 4 children and always had foster children for about 20 years. So Remy, Vera, Muriel, and Lionel are our kids. They are 27, 28, and above. Okay. So, and the last foster daughter, Selena, she still visits us a lot. She is 18, turning 18 actually in May. So that's our family. I go to church up the road in Seedorf. I'm part of the church council there, working actively within the church. I like camping with my wife. That's fun, taking off. And I like being with people sometimes. Sometimes not. So I can be on my own very easily, but I love working and studying with people, so that is clear. Technical stuff, I said, I do a bit of photography, and occasionally I take off on my bike and I'm somewhere else. So that's basically some of the parameters around me. Okay, so I think that's it. Let's get going. Sorry?
I was saying that's the most solid introduction I've ever seen.
I took a photo of it for the
graphic. Okay. Yeah. All right. So we are looking into Deuteronomy. Now, I love studying Deuteronomy, which takes a lot of time, and obviously we will not have that time. You will do some work on the book, but you will look at it from a topical approach. So my idea today would be that we start with content and study approach, background, what is it, and so on, how is it composed, what are the themes, all of this, and then look into some applications. But occasionally here and there, I will also talk about a few issues that are linked with the content. So we have an on and off with learning about the book and some applications. That is the idea. We are in the book of Deuteronomy in the area of Moab, northeast of the Dead Sea. And this is where Israel is preparing to enter the Holy Land. So after that, we'll have the book of Joshua and all that stuff. So I'm sure you're familiar with that. Now, if we are in this area, what we have there is Moses giving final instructions. And this took almost a year. If we look at the dates, we will see that in a moment. So Moses speaks a lot. Now, I'm not sure if you remember his arguments at the burning bush with God.
Oh, yes.
I'm not a good speaker, you know.
Yeah.
And here he is just talking and talking and talking all the time.
Wow, God.
And it looks like for almost a year. So either he was cheating on God, trying to get out of the job, which probably was the case with Exodus, or he learned, which is possible as well. But he is an excellent speaker. What we have in Deuteronomy is mainly speeches, not narratives like in Exodus, storytelling, but direct speeches. Now, when you study the Bible and you find speeches, this reflects the theology of the authors, because the speeches usually were longer. As I said, took about a year almost, this whole process. So speeches were longer, and therefore they would be condensed to the most important issues. And so they are an excellent tool to actually find out what were the ideas of the people, what would they consider being important and not so important. And the not important usually falls out or is just dropped. So basically you have a focus, a theological focus that is represented in the speeches. And in that case here, because the whole book is speeches, the whole book is a theological book, okay? It's dripping with theology, basically. Okay, and that is why we can learn from it. That's quite obvious then. So, what's the purpose of this book? Moses, it's recorded in chapter 29. These are the words of the covenant that the Lord commanded Moses to make with the people of Israel in the land of Moab. So that's where we are now. Besides the covenant that he had made with them at Horeb. So what we have basically is like a second covenant. Now we have a new generation of people. We will look at that in a moment. So basically, he is restating the covenant. It's not a new one, but it is stated and entered a second time. And this is part of the term, as we will see. So Moses is repeating a lot. Now this fits very well with Hebrew culture. Hebrew culture works on the principle of saying things and then coming back to it and coming back to it. It's very circular. This is going against our Western thinking. We like it linear, point 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's it. And if you look to some Asian culture or some African cultures, the circular fits very well into their thinking. So for us Westerners, bit of a problem. For people who are having a similar culture, very easy to follow. You repeat, you say things again. And we have a lot of that, of course, in Deuteronomy. The whole book sounds like a ceremony. I'm not sure, did you have time reading it? I don't know your schedule. Okay, but you will, huh? Okay.
We read it before, but
yeah, not for now. Okay, but when you read it, you realize it's very ceremonial. Okay, there are certain procedures that are included, certain emphases and repetitions, and remember this and don't do this and so on. Then we have witnesses at the end of the book. So it's more like a ceremony instead of just a book of information. So it's something that the people went through, and actually they were called to even read it again, to study it again. So it is something that has to be taught to other generations. Now, in general, at that time, there were different forms of contracts, covenants, we would call it with a biblical term, or treaties when it is economical. So basically, it's all the same. You make an agreement, you sign it, and then you try and live by it, basically. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. So we're good in changing them. So we have to look at these forms of covenant that were existing at the time, because Deuteronomy actually fits the criteria of one form. I mean, really one-on-one. Okay, so it is actually a legal document. It is a covenant. It's not just a story about something. It's way more than that. And of course, the covenant is between God and his people. Now, they don't have a choice, okay? He simply says, this is my covenant with you, eat it or break it. That's the two options. They either agree, and if they disagree, they break it. So that looks not very promising if you look at the process itself, but if you consider that God enabled them to enter that covenant, he liberated them before, and all the things he did before, it's a different story. They have God on their side, and they are not opposing someone who comes like the mafia. We have a good suggestion for you. Maybe you better agree. That's not the situation, okay? So God is on their side and not on his own, in that sense that he simply wants something from them. So we have all of this in Deuteronomy. This is the technical side of it. But of course, there are a lot of different topics, as we will see. Now, in your files that I'm not sure you got already or not, but look at the lecture. So this paper here, if you go to the very end, end is better. Where is the appendix? Here. There is an overview or a structure of the book. So Appendix 3, the last page is about authorship and date. This is just for those who are curious about this issue. I'm not going to look into that. But if you look at the structure, you have that. I will use that a bit and some other elements. So I have these as appendixes in the file. Okay. So if you want to look that up when I put it on the screen, you have it yourself somewhere. I'm not sure how you do it. Is that okay? Yep.
I have to think about how to ask my question. You have it structured out like the speeches.
Yeah.
But you're also talking about the fact that it's a covenant.
Yeah.
And I know that people kind of generally do one or the other. I might be mistaken in that, like in the way that they structure it, either with the covenant or with the speeches.
Yeah.
So are you sticking like I guess I don't know what my question is.
I try to implement both in my overview here. So if you look at it, somewhere I have it horizontally, that's easier. So if you look at it, I call it first, second, third speech. So that's a technical aspect of it with some further elements on the bottom. And then I have the content, what is in there. Okay, so I try to combine both structures. And then you see the overlap, which is really one-on-one. There's no difference.
Yeah, no, I see. Yeah, it makes sense.
So this is the big, basically we have 4 speeches.
Yeah.
And then ending the book. And they have certain technical terms, which I put on the bottom. But for us, it is important to see what's in there. So this is the content. What are the different parts? How are they grouped together and so on?
I think I just, in the past, hadn't connected that they're actually just exactly the same.
Yeah. Is that okay?
I'm just going to ignore my question.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So looking at the book, we can learn quite a bit, and we will look at the structure in a bit more detail. So that's something I'm trying to do. But we know it's a second covenant. We are in Moab. Moses is speaking. Today, the area of Moab is in Jordan, so we have a obviously different territorial assignment. But at that time, that was part of their place that they conquered on the way to Israel, basically, or to their new land. Now, of course, one of the big statements in Hebrew culture, which is also repeated by Jesus when he was asked, how can you summarize the law, was the passage that is called the Shema Israel. So hear Israel, the Lord your God is one God. And then you shall love your God, the Lord your God, with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. And I think we have countless songs made out of this passage here. So we are all aware of that text. So the purpose of the book is to make it clear to the people that there is one God and they are related to him and they should keep living in that relationship. Now we will see that unfortunately that didn't work out so well. Didn't take very long that they changed some of the parameters and they earned or harvested some of the problems that came along with it. So basically we see that there is a problem of maintaining that relationship. And if we think of application, which should be the end point of the lecture, it is always based on that there is God and he wants to relate to us human beings. He started with Israel on the way with Abraham and so on, and he continued to do that as we see also in the New Testament. So the basic foundation is God and should be loved with all our capabilities, basically. That's the idea here. And of course, Jesus added something to it in the New Testament. He said, and love your neighbor as yourself. So he also put in, let's say, social relationships as well. So it's a relationship to God and it's a relationship amongst people that is summarizing or summing up the law, basically. That is the idea. Okay, now let's look at a couple of terms here. If we look at the names of the book, some of the slides I still have the German version because it's different in German, but we keep it simple. We say 1 Moses to 5 Moses and then we're done. So you don't have to remember all these complicated names. So the names in Hebrew, they don't have a descriptive name. All the books in Hebrew always have the first key word or major word as the title. That is in the old times. Now, of course, it's changed when book printing took over. They gave titles as well. But Genesis is called Bereshit, which means in the beginning. Exodus, these are the names of those who left. So Velach Shemot. Then we have Leviticus, which is he called. So Vayikra. We have Numbers, which has 2 possible titles, even in Hebrew. One is, and he said, this is how the book starts, or in the desert, Bemidbar. So Vayadaber or Bemidbar. And Deuteronomy, even in Hebrew, has a long name because it's actually called Ella Hadebarim. These are the words. But for some people, that's too long, so they simply call it Devarim, which means words. And I put that up because it is so fitting with the content. That's what we have in Deuteronomy. It's very easy to remember. It's words, okay, in 10 sense of speeches. Now, the names came, that's very short only, came to us through the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. 2 books are from there. And later they came through the Latin translation. So that was about 250 before Christ. That was around 400 after Christ or so, a bit later. So we have a mix in our names that we use in English and in most languages except German, which is based either on Greek or on Latin. And we just turn them into our own language, basically. So that's very simple. If we look at the content of the books, We could say, if we look at the topic of redemption, which is the goal of all the Old Testament, pointing to what Jesus is doing, we have a plan of redemption in Genesis. It's starting to develop. We have, of course, then Abraham and the sons. So the people is coming into being, basically. In Exodus, we have the acts of redemption, the liberation and the continual provision of God. In Leviticus, we see a lot about the cost of redemption. Leviticus is a book which has a lot of details about how the whole sacrificial system should run. I usually call it's the manual for the tabernacle. Now, nobody reads the manuals today, okay? Most people don't. And that, because they're complicated and detailed, and this is exactly what we have in Leviticus. It's very complicated, detailed. You tend to lose overview because it's just too detailed. And plus, we're not using that thing anymore, okay? So why should you read a manual of something you're not using? Well, it still is instructive, I think, but that's one thing. Numbers is the joy of redemption. They have a first attempt that doesn't work, and the second one where it works, so they're looking forward. And Deuteronomy basically calls them to walk in that redemption. It's a call to do and a call to obey, basically. And similar, the other topics I just put there as an add-on. I'm not going into them. So you could look at the books in a topical way, and if we keep the line of redemption, I think this gives a good general direction of what these 5 books are doing. Now, looking at them together, I think, is important because it is helping us to understand what's going on in the 5 books. We know they are the most important books for the Jewish culture, the law. It's the foundation, the most important. For us, they are not so important because we tend to read more in the New Testament instead of the Old. But I think we need to understand some basics there. So if we put them beside each other, I always work with charts. So this overview here, these parts there, is basically what you see. Okay, come on, you can do that. Don't do that to me. So here we are. I don't like things like this. Okay, so basically this is the same structure back here, very simplified. Okay, so I'm just having an overview here with a few important passages in the book. So if we look at all 5 of them, there is a question of time here. Now, I'm not going into the time of Genesis because, first of all, it's almost impossible to define it. Secondly, it's too long ago anyways, so I'm just leaving it. Where we start with time usually is in Exodus 19, where the people are leaving Egypt, okay? So time-wise, we have Egypt as a place where people are leaving. If we look at the timeline of all of these books in detail, which I just point out one thing, the end of Genesis and up to chapter, where are we? Chapter 8, 9 in Exodus, something like this, up to chapter 12 in Exodus, that alone is 430 years in a few verses, okay? So it's covering major issues and dropping out a lot. Okay, so we have people coming to Egypt, they're staying there, and then they're leaving again. And this is summarized very briefly. Okay, so, but when they leave in Exodus 19, and then they come to the Mount Sinai in the wilderness, basically, and they are staying there at that place until they leave for the new territory, for taking the land. This goes, in terms of the story, from Exodus 19 to Numbers 10. Okay, but time-wise, this is 1 year. So here we have like 430 years in a few chapters. Here we have 1 year in 2.5 books. Okay, so you see the emphasis. The emphasis is not on history, but it's on theology. What did they learn from God? How did they meet Him? How would God give them things that they could live by for their further journey? Okay. Now, they also arrived in Moab in Numbers 22, and then Deuteronomy is just being in Numbers, there in Moab, and basically they have another year. It's 11 months and something, another year of that period. And in between, we have 38 years of traveling in the wilderness, which is summarized in a meager 12 chapters. Okay? I mean, it's quite obvious that time is not the issue here. It is actually the times where they meet God, which are important, and that is recorded in the text here. So when you look at Deuteronomy at the close of all of this here, this would be the major statements that are there that should be used then when they enter the land. Is that okay? So here we have theological purpose of these 5 books. Now there are a couple of things that I think are very important. The rest is just important. So let's look at the center here. Leviticus 16 is the Day of Atonement. That is when all of Israel is meeting before God, is purified, the tabernacle, the priests, everybody and everything is purified on that day. So basically we have Yom Kippur is the Hebrew name today. Kippur means to atone for. So basically we have the Day of Atonement here in the middle of the book. Okay. Now, somebody once asked me, is it really in the middle? And I had my computer counting Hebrew words. It's not. It is 57 and 43%. So it's a bit off the middle, but it's not bad. Okay. Now, in Hebrew thinking, usually the most important is in the middle. So when you work with a passage or in a text where you can see it starts here and ends here, normally in the middle you would have the most important. Yeah. So that really helps with working with ancient Hebrew text. Now, what does that mean? It means that they can be united with God and they can live in relationship with God. This is provided by God. So that is one of the teachings. And this is the starting point. The second part is in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, back here, where we have a list of blessing and curse. And there it is not about how to get holy or anything like that. It is about how to remain holy. So this is basically by obeying God's standards. And He calls them to obey them, and therefore He would bless them, or if they disobey, He will curse them. Okay, and there, chapter 28 is a long list of these blessings and curses, and in chapter 27 He's introducing the topic, starting with curse and then changing into blessing for a while. So basically we have a big issue there, and that is how should they live? And this is part of the book of Deuteronomy as well. Okay, so it is how they can come into a relationship with God, which is in the middle, and how they can stay in a relationship with God, which is in the end of these 5 books. So the purpose is primarily theological. I think this is what we can learn from these. So if we look at the content in general, we have a second time, Deutero, the law, nomos, and that is our Deuteronomy. And this is, as we read in chapter 29, this is the verse. Moses is instructed to enter with them in a second time in the covenant. It is renewed, and it is because in the wilderness, the first generation died, and the second grew up and has to enter the covenant now. Now, a little technical detail. Not everybody of the first generation died. It is limited to the men who were refusing to go for war. So it's the men who were above 20 and up to 45. That's the age where people would go to war there. And therefore, this generation of men in that age range, they died. Others lived. Ladies, kids lived. Okay, so not everybody died in the wilderness and the new generation is there. So when they come to the border a second time in Moab, there are some who know the whole story because they have been part of it. Okay, so they have the background, they have all the experiences and everything. And some, of course, are new to this. Yes?
Does it say that not everyone in the wilderness died?
Yes.
In this generation?
Yeah, I didn't list the passage. Oh, it is here. Deuteronomy 2:14 and 135 actually states that it is the men of war who are to die in the wilderness. So it's limited. Commonly we think, oh, the whole generation died, but that's not the case.
Yeah, it says, can I read it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
It says, and the time for our leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the brook Zered was 38 years, until the entire generation, that is, the men of war, had perished in the camp as the Lord has sworn to them.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a limited choice of people, still a lot, I think, but that's what we have. So that's why there needs to be a new covenant, because there are so many people who are not familiar with the old covenant that took place before. Okay. So renewal with the new generations. That's it, basically. Now, let me look at that. Yeah, so let's look at some structure here. I don't have readings yet. Yeah, that's it. So we have chapter 1. I'm usually leaving away the introduction verses, so I start with 1:6. Obviously, it starts with 1:1, but this is not a big topic. This is just opening the book. So we have a summary of the journey in the first 4 chapters, with a call to obey God towards the end of those chapters, basically, of chapter 4. So that is one thing there. Also, we have at the end, in chapter 4, the list of the cities of refuge. I will talk about that in a moment because that's important for us, also in terms of application in our society and so on. But this is the first speech. Then we have a very long speech, and that is going from chapter 5 to 29, ending with 29:1. In English, in German, it's 28:69. We have different verse numbers there, but we can live with that. So it's actually basically including chapter 28, but the first verse there. Now we have in there some instructions how they perform the entering of the covenant on 2 mountains. I will point that out as well a bit later. The mountains have the name Ebal and Gerizim. I don't know of any further meaning of that, but if we look at the picture, we will see that's the meaning, how they actually did it. Okay, this is very interesting to see. There are 3 parts there. In chapter 5, we have first the conditions of the covenant. That goes to chapter 11. In chapter 12, we have the collection of the law, which would be a lot of individual regulations. So if we look at our overview here, again, we see that here we have the requirements of the covenant, and then we have the law, and that goes from 12 onwards, a lot of different regulations there. And then we have an exhortation, very short, at the end to actually do it, to perform it. So which is 2 chapters basically at the end. So the major part here would be the collection of the law, which is largely repetition of what we have in Exodus, partly Leviticus, where the laws are listed in more detail. Okay? So this is the summary of the covenant of the law, which is in these chapters. And then, of course, we have what happens when they don't or they do obey it. That's 28. So that's closing off the whole area here of blessing and curse. And then we have the closing speeches. First, 29 and 30, the exhortation to keep the covenant, and Moses is kind of challenging them there a bit. You cannot do it, but you will. Yes, we want, and so on. So there is a challenge to actually do it. And then the final words, there is installing of Joshua as new leader, final exhortation, and even a song of Moses. So he wasn't only good in speaking, also in singing, apparently. Well, we don't get the comment on the song, though, so not sure how good it was. But we have, that's basically making up the structure here. So this is the technical and content-wise what's going on in the book. Okay. And if we look at it, we see that Moses actually wrote them down and gave them to the priests in order to proclaim them to the people in the whole land. So let's look at that text briefly. Then Moses wrote this law, gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them at the end of every 7 years, at a set time of the year of release, at the Feast of Booths. So they said, you have a Feast of Booths every year. On the 7th year, you read the law to them. Okay. When Israel comes to appear before the Lord at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, little ones, sojourner, travelers, people living with them, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the words of these laws. Okay, so what is instituted there is actually, let's say, theological education system. Okay, he is not just giving them the law, here you have it. He's saying, okay, now you have it. Now we have two categories of people that are responsible: priests, Levites, and elders. So those who lead, either religious or political, social. They should know and live the law and teach it every 7 years to everybody. Okay, so we have principles of education. Now we will look at some other areas of society, and I'm sure you have already. It's part of the course. So and you can define them in different ways. Doesn't matter, but there are areas of society, and they are all reflected in Deuteronomy. Okay, if we look for them, also in the other 5 books, we will see that basic principles, how we could manage or run something from a perspective with God included, of course, we have basic principles there. This is the first one which speaks of education. How do you transfer the things that are important to the people and to the next generations? And the suggestion here is every 7 years. Okay? So for us, that would mean we could point out a time during the year where every 7 years we read the whole Bible. Okay? That would be an option. It's not that bad. It takes about 80 hours. So that's what a week of reading, and then you're done. Now, if you plan that every 7 years, you're taking up a pattern that might be helpful. One thing is sure, it will be very tiring. Okay, so not sure if you want to do that. But God installed through Moses principles by which the truth could be conveyed to the next generation. And I think this is quite important to see here. Okay? Now, if we look at the content, we have a lot of repetition. So let me take up the horizontal chart again here, and I make that a bit larger so we can actually almost read it. I'm not sure how it does over the internet, but it could work, huh? With that size. So when we are looking at the summary of the journey, obviously this is not a repetition, this is just looking back what happened. Okay. And since Numbers is not very extensive with the journey, we have a few details that we don't see in Numbers here, and we have them in Deuteronomy. We have an ending. Let me move that up, that's a bit better. So we have an ending here in chapter 4, which shows Israel's obligation to God. So they have to relate to him. They have no option, basically. But this is an exhortation, a positive one, that they should obey the law. And then we have the cities of refuge on the other side of the Jordan, which they would basically establish. And we will have to look at the meaning of that, because that's part of the judicial system. Very interesting as well. Of course, we have the 10 Commandments. We are all familiar with those, which I hope we can look at some details there as well. And then there are quite a few things. I marked them with slight yellow. I'm not sure if it's seen on the internet, but these are all repetitions from other books. So what we have here is a summary of the law with the most important points put into a form of a contract. That doesn't mean that this is everything, but it's the major things. And there are more details in Exodus and in Leviticus, obviously. Okay. Now we have a couple of topics here. Can you read it this way, or should I turn it? Let me turn it. Okay, that's easier. So we have a couple of issues there. First of all, chapter 12, we have the place of sacrifice that will be defined, which means, if we think of it in technical terms, this is a law about centralizing the place of worship. So we have a law of centralization. Okay, this is the technical term as it's used today in Bible dictionaries and so on, which means from the beginning, God planned that they would have one central place of worship. Now, we will see that the tabernacle at the beginning, especially time of Joshua and Judges, moved around quite a bit, and only under David it finally came to one location. But he chose his own, well, with the help of God and with some problems that he created. But anyways, he chose the location, and before it was in different locations. Okay, so we have that. Then we have commands concerning purity. If you look at the laws in Leviticus, a lot of them deal with either being pure or impure. And what the tabernacle is, simplified, it is a repair system. Things that can be repaired in your relationship with God have to be done in a certain way. And this is how this is described in Leviticus. So there are commands how you can regain your purity. Now, this, interestingly enough, is nowhere talking about attitude. It's always talking about action. So if you do your stuff the right way, assuming that you have a proper attitude but not stating it, God says, you'll be clean again, I relate to you again, and so on. So there is a factual procedure how you can relate again to God. No thread of uncertainty. You do it this way. If you broke it, then you come, you bring your sacrifice, and you're done. You're fine again. Okay. Now, attitude would be another issue. How do you do it? Are you proud and now I'm back again, or whatever? That's another story. But the procedure is clear, and God commits himself to that procedure. Now, this is in sharp contrast to any other gods that were around in the surrounding nations. You never knew what they were doing. And basically all the system of bringing sacrifices to those gods was, how can you twist the arms of those gods so they act on your behalf? That's the principle. If they did was another question. Maybe, maybe not. But here what we have is a reliable system commands concerning purity. You're impure for some reason. Maybe you touched someone who was dead or a dead animal. You're impure. That doesn't mean you're dirty. It's not the same. You are religiously not allowed to enter God's presence before you go through a certain process. Same is with the menstruation of the women. They are impure, not dirty. That's not the issue. They are not of lesser value. They're just not allowed to access God's presence. They have to go through some purification, and then they are allowed again. So what we have here is a reliable system of how you can get back into relationship with God, which is unique. This didn't exist in the other cultures. Okay. Then we have similar instructions here concerning finances and feasts. Now in Switzerland, there is a saying, it's not true, but it's a saying, you never talk about finances. We actually do a lot. But still, you don't talk with others about your personal finances. Okay. This is excluded from conversation. God doesn't exclude it. He puts it in there. Okay. You are responsible with the means that he provided for you, how you use them for yourself and in relation to others. Okay. So it's not private only. It is personal, but it's not private. Okay. So I think this is an interesting aspect. And of course, feasts are connected with that because usually that involves donations and money and all that as well. So we have another issue. We have then a lot of judicial commands. And interesting here is we have commands about the king. Nowhere on the horizon is a king yet in the Bible. Okay, that comes in the time of the judges where people think we might be better off with a king instead of those guys. But up till there, no king is around. Yet the law, what a king should not do, is there. And we then have a prime example in the book of Kings of a king who fulfilled all of these criteria, and that was Solomon. He did all of them. And here it says he shouldn't do it. Okay, so the great light of Solomon gets a bit of a shade when you match him with the royal law here. Okay, so this is quite interesting. Of course, we have issues about criminal acts, war, murder, capital punishment. So these are social relationships and, of course, wrong developments in social relationships. And then we have a few groups of miscellaneous commands. Maybe I could work on a better title, but I thought this is easy. It's just a bag full of commands, basically, or two bags here. And then some liturgical commands and final exhortations. So liturgical means how do you do your stuff before God, basically. So this is what we have in this middle part. It's very detailed, but it's very interesting to learn principles that we could apply in our societies from it. Yeah.
How come the miscellaneous commands are split? Is there like a change in?
Yeah, I thought there was a shade of change here, but they're still not the same. So, so otherwise, and sometimes I don't like too big, very big blocks of text here. So, yeah. So you could group them in a different way, or say it's just one, and so on. So no problem. Yeah. Okay. So this is what we have there, and then when we go towards the end, we have the whole issue of blessing and curse and the ritual they actually performed at these two mountains. We have the covenant of God, and Moses is actually telling the people, you choose between life and death now. Okay, that's pretty radical. Okay, saying this is your choice now, life or death. And then we have the closing words, basically. So it's a very well composed book, very interesting. And it's basically laying the foundation for a society. Okay. I'm not sure how long do I go until a break.
15.
Okay. Good.
Is it, we can do it now, or
No, I'm fine.
if you 5 minutes longer, 10, 15.
No, 10, 15 is good. Yeah. Okay. I'll try to be on time. Okay, so when we look at this, we see that Deuteronomy has a special function. It is looking backwards with the review, restating of the law, summarizing everything, challenging them, and so on. And it is looking forwards, saying this is how you have to live. Mainly chapter 28, of course, a few more things, but that's the major one. This is what you have to do now. Okay, so this is what God did. This is what you have to do now. Okay, now, interesting, this is a similar structure if we look at the New Testament of the Gospels and Acts. This is what I did for you. Now it's your turn. Okay, and the issue is to be obedient to God, to listen to the Spirit, and to go where He leads. And this is how the story is told in Acts 10. So we have a similar function here of a change from the previous into the new. I usually call that, it's like a hinge, okay, in a door. It's connected to both parts, but it has importance for both areas. So the blessing and curse is there, of course. This is an important issue. And let me just look at this. Will we look at it? No, I'll look at it after the break, I think. So we'll see if we get there. So Deuteronomy is, in that sense, the most important book in the 5 books of the law, because it is restating covenant, they're entering it, and it's summarizing everything that was before, but it's also laying the ground for after. Now, this blessing and curse thing, did you ever look at that in detail or not? Yeah.
Not in this.
Okay. So, I mean, the chapter is in itself is quite interesting. I'll use the text anyways now. So let me see. That's it. Okay. So what I did was, this is simply the text, okay? Left side is obedience that brings blessing, and then there's a list of what blessings. Right side is disobedience that brings curse. So let me just scroll through it to make a first point here. If you look at it, the blessing ends very quick. And the curse goes on and on and on and on and on and on. It's 4.5 times more on that side than on the blessing, okay? Which shows the needed emphasis. They needed the warning, okay? That was important for them. So the categories are largely the same. We will look at some of them a bit later. But the point is that obedience produces blessing and disobedience produces curse. Now, this sounds awfully mechanical. Would you agree? You obey, blessing. You disobey, curse. Okay. And this is what was a problem for the Israelites later on, even into the time of the New Testament. They understood it this way. It's not a mechanical principle or physics. It is dependent on the relationship to God. So if you are obedient in your relationship to God, then this will work. If you're disobedient, the other will work, okay? But if you don't care about God, this principle doesn't apply, or let's say only this part applies, because you're excluding God, and therefore He will not bring His blessing. He might still help you so you don't drown immediately in order to learn something, but in general the blessing is not that present anymore. So it is dependent on the relationship to God, and this is the basic issue. Now we will have to look at this for a moment, because it is the major tool, working tool of the prophets. Okay, so if you would say that, where are we here? You know the Swiss Army knives, of course, or at least you've heard of them. So every Swiss has somewhere an army knife. I don't have it in the pocket. I'm having it there. So this is our major tool for some people. Okay. Now, if you look at the prophets, blessing and curse, and the categories are their major tool. That's what they're using, okay? So they constantly, when they meet someone and something is wrong, what they do, oh, let's see, here we have the problem, and then they use some of the curse or some of the blessing if they had a reason to speak it, which was not so often. So basically, it's the major tool for the prophet. So if you understand these categories and you know them, it's a lot easier to understand the prophets. Yes?
As a physical way of continuing to learn, can we see you start with that? Can we pass it around? Is that okay?
Sure.
No,
Huh? Don't cut your fingers. Yeah,
but this is not the original one.
that's a true one.
This is not the one from Deuteronomy.
No, that is the real Swiss Army.
It's not from Moses.
Yeah, I have the one from Moses, but I can't open it anymore. It's very rusty. No, just joking.
Wait, so Moses was Swiss?
Huh?
Moses was Swiss?
Yes. He's
Yeah.
German. Was it like?
You have to ask Marcus about the details there.
He's Tamil,
Yeah.
He speaks Tamil, I think.
Yeah, so be careful, it really cuts very well, okay, so. Okay, so I cannot pass it around in Kochi, so sorry about that. So you have to, you know, I can leave it here for a moment. I will take it away before I leave because kids are in the house. So it is the major toolbox of the prophets, and it really helps to understand these categories. Okay, so that is quite helpful. Now, what we will see if we look at this picture again here, it looks forward into these books, and I will try and explain how this issue of blessing and curse is shown in these books. Okay, so we see the function of Deuteronomy, and with the idea they should learn it, they entered the covenant, it should be taught regularly. It means that this is something that should be actually in the brains of the people, okay, all the time. So if I would suggest any book from Genesis to Kings to know well, I think Deuteronomy would be the choice, because it's laying so many foundations and therefore very important. Okay, 15:15 means break.
Wow, you're like
Right.
exactly on time.
He's Swiss.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So fun.
We now take a break until 11.
Okay. Good.
Woo!
So
Okay, 30 minutes break.
this train
Kochi.
Yeah.
goes to both 90,
We
and
have
so
no choice.
no choice.
We can choose anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, but you choose anyway. Good, thank you, and then we'll give back to Heinz.
Okay. So even after the break, obedience or curse. So. Okay. So looking at the influence of this chapter in the following books is quite important, because they are using that principle to illustrate how actually the Israelites obeyed or did not obey. So the question of these books here in our Bibles today, normally we call them the historical books. They were not. They were the prophets. They were the early prophets, which means they want to teach something. And the main topic that they are trying to teach is, how did they do with obeying or not obeying? How did God show this principle in their history? Now, they were not written for that purpose. This is often discussed in theology, but they reflect the idea all the time. Okay, so they basically illustrate this anyways. So looking at the books here, that was starting anyways. So these are my Joshua to Kings. You know the format already. And in general, it's going uphill up to 1 Kings 12. Okay, now, of course, Judges with a bit of hang-ups. Okay, sometimes up, sometimes down, sometimes lower than before and then up again. But in general, they can keep it more or less. So don't rely on the accuracy of the graph. It's just
Yeah.
displaying the principle, okay? So it's going uphill, they get the land and the rest under Joshua. Then for the first few judges, it works pretty fine, and then disaster starts, okay? On and off. And in the end, some of the judges are really the problem, not the surrounding nations, like with Samson and so on. So, but the issue here is, in spite of all these ups and downs, God was able to use these imperfect, sometimes stupid, sometimes stubborn or whatever people in order to achieve his purposes. And I think this is important to notice. So he gave them saviors, they could keep it. In the end, they decided they want a king. Samuel is the last judge, and he prepares for the kingdom, not so willingly, but he does. So they get the kingdom, they get a king. Eventually, they have David as a king, and they have the capital, and now they have the central place. So we have a few hundred years here until this centralization law is actually at work, okay? Now, so they have the kingdom, the place, then they get the temple under Solomon, and everything looks bright and clear. Although there are a lot of tensions in the story that already foreshadow the problem. Okay, so, but when we read it, we'll see that. But anyways, after Solomon with his son Rehabeam, the whole trouble starts. Rehabeam is not the cause, but he is the final famous drop in the water that spills the bucket, basically. So he is the final step that leads into the catastrophe. Solomon was very busy preparing for that. So it's not only Rehabeam's problem. So it's going downhill, they separate, they are at war, and they lose everything. So they lose the temple, they lose the kingdom, they lose their saviors, they have no land and no rest. Basically, they were where they were. Yeah. Okay, meaning that nothing again, and we're sitting in Babylon. A few people remained, poorer people usually. Infrastructure was totally down, and they ended up in exile. And this illustrates what obedience does and what disobedience does. Okay, and sometimes it's done with very graphic stories, spending a lot of time on, let's say, Jericho and Ai with Joshua, obedience, disobedience. So you have a lot of space for that in order to see how this principle worked that is established in Deuteronomy 28. So this is, I think this is important to notice. Now, I don't think I need to go through all the details here. If we look at the text with, where are we here? With the chapter here, we have a lot of negative things and some positive ones. And a large part, if you go on the list here, a large part is this statement here on the right side, almost at the same level as the blessing, where it says, "You shall grope about at noon as blind people grope in darkness, but you shall be unable to find your way. You shall be continually abused and robbed without anyone to help." If they throw out God, that's the result. Yes?
Which chapter is this?
That's 28.
Yes.
Deuteronomy 28, verse 29.
Thank you.
And so it's basically saying there will be total abuse and helplessness. And then he's listing where this abuse will take place. And I find this list very striking. So it will be, if you look on the right side, in marriage, in your possession properties, in harvest, in your working capabilities, with your cattle, so farming and so on. In family life, you will end up in slavery. Harvest, health, in your land, worship, respect, harvest again. It's a farming community, this is obvious. And then, of course, if you have harvest, you have wine, olive oil. That's the two main things there. Family life and so on. And all of this is illustrating how helpless they would be when God is out of the picture. Okay? So we often have discussions. What is the curse of God? We know what the blessing is. And my summary is very simple. I'm not sure whether it's right or wrong. I'm a Bible student, not a theologian. So, but my point is very simple. The blessing, the curse of God is when the blessing is missing. That's enough. The rest we can easily do ourselves, which we do, which means we are destructive and everything when God's blessing is out of the picture. And basically that's enough. So all he has to do is withhold his blessing and we'll do the rest, which is hell on earth, basically, as we see now, very well illustrated in our time in various places. So it illustrates how much can be lost. And of course, these issues here, they would be very interesting in studying and saying, okay, we have all these categories where God wants to be involved, so it runs well. And then the question is, how can he be involved there so things run well? How can we make sure that God is in that picture in all of these areas of life, in agriculture and so on? So all of these areas you can take and then try and study and find out how you can involve God in these areas. So Deuteronomy, a very good book for that purpose here. Okay, I'll close that text here. Don't need that anymore. And looking at the whole thing, simplifying is always good. We have basically these categories of blessing. We have life, health, good crops, prosperity, respect and esteem by others, and security. And with life, that also means children, good growth of cattle and all that, that's part of it. Curse, we have contrast to that, drought, death, sickness, drought, lack, danger, misery, destruction, disfavor, defeat, and exile, already stated in Deuteronomy. So before they started, the exile was already stated, which I think is interesting as well. Okay, so very challenging. So when you know these categories, it's a lot easier to handle the prophets, especially the prophets like we would call them, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all those guys, the little ones, the major, minor. Because when Joel speaks of the locusts and of the other bugs that come and destroy and so on, he is not giving a lecture on growth of crop or so on. He's talking about obedience or disobedience.
Yeah.
That's it. So when we can make that connection from the categories, it's a lot easier to handle the prophets there. Okay. Now, practically, it was visible with the nations that they did not drive out at first. So we have the ones in the east, the Amorites, Ammon, Moab, and Edom, and they were all basically relatives, not the Amorites, but Ammon, Moab, and Edom. So through Lot or through Isaac, So they were family, and the others who are here were all the nations that they should drive out. So if we look at those, well, the Amorites, they had to drive out because they refused to come to an agreement. So they said, okay, if you want war, we have war, and then the other guys lost. So basically that's the story. So that's how they got the eastern territories of Jordan. And if you look at the nations here, you have all these lists with the ites at the end. Whatever ites you want, you find them here. And it's basically a list of those who lived in the central area on the hills, with a couple of exceptions like the Philistines, who were more in the coastlands, and some of the Amalekites here, also on the coastlands. But the rest was all on the hill. And so basically, they had to drive them out. Some they did, some they didn't.
I can't actually remember, even though I've read it many times, but did God actually command them to destroy the Philistines as well?
Yes, to drive them out. We have two issues here. If we study Joshua, some of it is destruction, some of it is driving the people out. And it's not even that easy to define it. So that would be some of the results here.
So would you say even today there are knock-on consequences to their disobedience with the Philistines? Or I know it's difficult to put into
people using the name Palestinians today
Yes.
are not related to the Philistines.
Okay.
It's a later migration movement
Okay.
during the Ottoman and Arab empires and so on.
Oh.
So it was not settled for a long time, then resettled by other people, and then we have the post-World War II, Balfour Declaration, all that stuff, where people
Yeah.
resettled and then the conflicts began.
For some reason, I thought they were distant
Descendants or something.
descendants.
Yeah, no, they're not. Yeah.
Okay.
So the claim for the land is, I mean, it's a Muslim Jewish issue, and for both sides, the claim is based on religious historical experiences and not on hereditary in the sense of
Yes.
having lived there all the time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for
so-
the clarity.
Okay, so here you see also by whom they were able to drive out or not, how obedient or disobedient they were, or how lenient. They were basically mixing things, and therefore they were not always successful. Now, what we have to understand, if we look at this map, and that's why I actually listed the names here, is we have a total different belief system between Israel and between all of these tribes here. Okay. Here you have, what was it, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 are listed. Maybe there were a couple more groups around. So let's say we have 10 groups, and that means we have definitely 10 different belief systems. 10 different main gods. Some may overlap, but they have a different name in that territory. If you walk 10 kilometers down the road, same God is still active, but he has another name because you're in another territory. The thinking of gods was very, very geographical. Okay. No God was around in their cultures here that would be a universal God. God was always related to the well-being of the people. The well-being was always related on the agriculture, because all societies at that time were agricultural societies. A couple of exceptions like the Sidon and Tyre, the Phoenicians, who were trading people. But other than that, they were all dependent on the land where they lived and how well it worked. So all the gods related to that process. It was agricultural gods. They had to do with fertility, with rain. They were war gods because they had to do with protecting your areas. And when you moved into another territory, you were under the authority of another god. Now, when Israel came, God was holy in Midian, where Moses met him. God was holy in Egypt. God was holy in the wilderness. And when Joshua crossed into the land, he met the angel of the Lord, who told him, take your shoes off because the ground is holy. So we're dealing with a God who is everywhere God. Okay, and that's a total different claim. And this is not easy to learn. The Israelites lived 400 years at least in Egypt, in a society where you understood gods regionally, not universally. They were moving around and trading with people who had all the same thinking, okay? And suddenly you have to change to a God who is universal. That's not easy. So Deuteronomy would lay the ground to learn who that God is, to agree with him, and it would then also help to see God's efforts to help them, to understand it, and therefore change the thinking. But that's never fast, okay? And unfortunately with Israel, it didn't work, because they fell back into the old patterns, and they said, okay, now we're here, now these guys are still around, and of course they have their God, and yeah, I mean, last week they were praying, and 2 days later it was raining, so apparently that works as well. And suddenly you start to mix things, which we call synchronism today, which is what happened, okay? This is a constant problem throughout Israel's history and the Old Testament, that they mixed things and they were not obedient to the very end, and therefore cultivated their own problems, basically. Solomon had trade agreements. When you have a trade agreement, you marry other wives from that other nation or king, when you marry another wife, she has to be allowed to worship her own God, not just yours. So you have to import all these gods even. So with Solomon, it grew even worse. Okay, so we have a lot of very logical reasons how all the surrounding influenced their society. So they did not have God in the center, but somehow they moved to a God plus version, which usually doesn't work because it's not a plus, it's a minus. It sounds too good to be true. Yes.
I don't know enough exactly what the specifics are about what God says about trading with other nations. I'm pretty sure he says not to, but I'm not completely sure with that. But I find it's very interesting to me that with Solomon, he says don't intermarry with other nations, of course, but then how does that work with trade agreements and things then? Do you
Well,
know
you could,
that?
I mean, you could invent your own system. You don't have to go by the others. You say, okay, we are not doing that. We can make a trade agreement, we can make a contract and everything, but we could exclude the marriage issue.
Yeah.
So David did it with Hiram, one of the kings in the Lebanon and so on. So we have examples how it worked.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there isn't a specific law that says don't trade with other.
No. What is the laws are on not accumulating money, riches.
Yeah.
Which of course touches on how you trade and what for you trade.
Yeah.
So that is yeah.
Don't have too many horses.
Riches
Yeah.
and gold.
Horses, the wives, the money, the gold, and the fame. Yeah, and Solomon had everything. So
Kings were
okay, so we have the ongoing problems here, and we see them in Deuteronomy, and they had to come to a new understanding, basically. What is society with that different God? Now, one big difference, of course, is the contract issue here. Now, you have an example of that in your papers as well. I'm not going through it step by step, but I just take the whole picture here. What happened was that all the time the people had agreements with each other. Now, there was a people group called the Hittites. We read of them. It's not the ones that are mentioned in the Old Testament. They are probably descendants and small minor groups of the Hittites. The Hittite Empire was huge. It was basically what Turkey is today. Okay, with a few bits less on the western side, but it was huge up there, and it reached into the Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, Iran. So it was huge. They were not an aggressive people group, so not many wars. We don't find a lot about wars with them, but they were trading, and they were very smart. So from about 1750 BC to 1200 BC, they were the big power, but not aggressive. Okay. And what happened was they were making agreements with people. And about, it's close to 100 years now, I think 90 years ago, there were a whole library of clay tablets discovered in Hattusha, which is near Ankara, where was their capital, with a lot of trade agreements and contracts. So clay tablets means you write with a sharp piece of wood, you press it in different shapes, and it makes these little lines that are, so cuneic writing is the idea, or the title for it. And from that, and there were literally thousands of clay tablets, they could actually learn about trade in this time. Now, 1750 to 1200, that is our time in Deuteronomy. Okay, that's when they travel. So at that time, there were three kinds of covenant that were common, and they were common because they were with different nations. They were common amongst all the nations, not just one. Otherwise, you don't trade. So they had what they call a parity covenant, which is between equal partners. So you agree on level. Okay, so you do this, we do that, and nobody's dominating. We're just agreeing together. We have that in the Bible as well. I list a few examples there, but you can look them up if you want to. So that's one thing. That can be people or nations. That's always possible. Then there is what is called a suzerainty treaty or covenant, which means one party is stronger and is dictating the covenant, and the weaker party has to fulfill it. Okay, this is the second option that we have. So we have a stronger and a weaker party. And then there is also what is called a suzerainty testament, which is only one-sided. A stronger party decides to help or do this and so on and just promises it. No action on the other side, no consequences except beneficial ones. Yes?
So is that suzerainty or suzerainty?
Suzerainty. Did I write it wrong? Oh, here it's wrong. Yeah, I told you typing errors. Here it is right, suzerainty.
So they're both the same.
Yeah. But I mistyped here. Okay, this is my standard procedure. I recognize the typing errors with help of other people. Okay, so there are these three covenants that they found and that existed and could be established. And historically, of course, Deuteronomy fits in there. And it does fit exactly into that setting. Okay, so Deuteronomy is a suzerainty covenant between a stronger and a weaker party. The stronger one being God, the weaker one being Israel. Which means God tells them, this is my contract, you have to enter, and when you enter that contract or the covenant, this is how you have to keep up. Now, again, this is rather strange that a God would enter a covenant with a people, because it is absolutely reliable. God made himself reliable. People could call on him and say, but you said this and this and this. Now you have to fulfill it. Okay, now he might also say, yeah, but you said this and this, and you have to fulfill it. That's the other part. But it was an agreement that could be trusted, it was reliable, and it was not random at all. So for their society and the building of society, I think this is the first major principle, besides obedience and disobedience, that they had to learn, that you deal with each other on a basis of reliability, trustworthy, and you commit to stick to it, basically. So this is very new. This would not exist in other cultures in terms of relationship to gods. The gods never say they are doing this or that. They may do something, but they never say what. And this is culminating into even worse regions when you look at the gods of the Greeks later.
Yes.
So 500 years later, So basically we have this agreement here. Of course, God was saying, if you accept it, fine. If you reject it, you disobey, and therefore there will be curse. Okay, that is part of the agreement. But he was doing all the preparation steps so they could even get there. He took them out of Egypt and helped them and so on. One thing I didn't show you with the overview of Exodus, when you look at the book, they broke the covenant after Moses was instructed how to build the tabernacle. God forgave them. Then they built the tabernacle. So forgiveness was not based on the tabernacle. Okay, it was based on God's grace. He forgave them before they even had the tool to receive forgiveness, which I think is quite interesting. So it's God's grace, and he is absolutely dependable.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a question with that, because obviously with Abraham before, and those, it was all based on grace and by faith.
Yeah.
How is it that he was able to give, the commandments and make that covenant with them, and then they sinned so much after that, but then he was able to forgive them without sacrifices? How does that work?
Because it was never dependent on the sacrifice.
No.
It was always dependent on the trust and forgiveness of God. Okay. So what are the sacrifices for?
Yeah.
In our church, I had this discussion often. People say, I just have a hard time trusting a God who needs blood in order to be happy and satisfied again. And I said, well, I have problems with that idea as well. Can I explain what really happened? And that's a fun discussion afterward. So the point is, doing the sacrifice gave them who did the sacrifice the assurance that everything was done properly, and therefore they would know the relationship was reestablished. God didn't need that. The people needed. It's the same story with Abraham. Abraham and Isaac going for a sacrifice. People say God needed to see whether Abraham was faithful or not. No, Abraham needed to see whether he was faithful or not. God knew what he was doing all the time. Okay, so it's usually on the weaker side, if we talk of this picture here, that needs affirmation and confirmation. And God knew, God did forgive. And the little animal or the parts of animal or grain or whatever, they did not change the attitude of God. They helped the people to change their attitude. So I think this is an important issue to see about the purpose of the sacrifices. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So when we look at this list here, we see that there are a few elements which are always there in this suzerainty covenant here. And this is what I want to try and look. There's always an introduction or a preamble, which is a smart word for foreword. But all the literature that you read about this is always using the technical terms. I hate that, but well, anyways. So it is introducing the covenant partners. Who is part of the game here? That's the first point. Then we have a historical, rhetorical prologue. So look at history with smart words. Okay. Events that led to the agreement. Reviewing the history, how we got there, is basically the point here. After that, we have the stipulations, which are the individual laws, the regulations that have to be observed. That is usually the longest part. Then we have more regulations and laws, how it shall work out and how it shall be kept. And in the end, we have the witnesses that are called upon, which usually were strange witnesses. That normally they were not people, because people die too quickly. So they were rocks and heaven and trees and rivers and whatever you would call upon, and especially the gods that both parties believed in. So you would call upon your God, and the others would call upon their God for a witness for this agreement. Yep.
Within the area of witnesses, would that be when they would usually make oaths as well?
Yeah, it's part of it, yeah. So the oaths were actually made before, and the witnesses would then testify that they have heard the oaths, and therefore say, now it is binding. Okay, yeah. And then we have, if you don't do it, this happens, and if you do it, this happens. We are back to our blessing and curse here. Okay, so this is how these contracts of the Hittites, trading agreements, usually were made up. Okay, now if you translate that, let's look at something else. Around 900 BC, which is about 100 years into Israel's kingdom, these covenants changed. The Hittites ended around 1200, 1100. They basically disappeared because of huge migrations of the sea people and so on. And eventually they were not there anymore. And the contracts were shortened. No more prologues, no more witnesses, and only curse. Much more practical if you disobey. This is what we call small print in our contracts today. This is usually where the curse lies. But when you buy a car, read the small print, because that's the curse. Okay, so this is how the contracts changed. And this is an indication that Deuteronomy was actually written earlier than that, because it still uses the full format of the contracts or the covenants there.
So did God give them this way of doing things, or did they interpret what he said into their culture?
I don't know. That would be, it's a question that I have, and I have no answer for it, because we don't know, did God tell them do it this way? Or did he say to Moses, do it, you know how to do it. And then he used what he knew, and that was that culture. We never know. Okay, how much was dictated, how much was room to do it themselves? That's not easy to answer.
Do you know why it was simplified or shortened as well?
More aggressive cultures coming up, more
Okay.
warfare.
Yeah.
After the Hittites came the Assyrians,
Yeah.
and then the trouble started.
Mhm.
So you don't want to give too much
Yes.
if you can control them. And this is what happened.
Ah.
So you leave the elements that are not so important, and you focus on those who are important for you, the stronger party.
Interesting.
Yeah, like if you even, I was just thinking about if you look at contracts these days,
Yeah.
they're like almost even more simplified.
Yeah, of course, very
Yeah.
basics. Yeah.
Like nothing-
And it's understandable, and of course your life usually doesn't depend on it. Well, most of the time.
Wow.
But so basically you simplify it, which is clear, but
Yeah.
it also has to do with developments of culture. Yeah. Okay, so we have this here, and if we translate that now to Deuteronomy, this is how the structure is made up. So we have the preamble, this is the introduction, 5 verses. We have the historical prologue, which is the first speech. We have a 3-part second speech, stipulations, regulations, blessing and curse. We have the third speech, the conditions, repetition, and the witnesses at the end. Okay, final words. So it really just, you can just stick it to the format. And it almost looks like Moses downloaded a pre-formatted Hittite contract and said, let's do the one with God this way. And then he just filled in. That's what you can do today. You download a pre-formatted one and you just fill it in. So it could be, it appears to have that aspect to it. So they knew about these contracts, they used it, and with that, they used something which was familiar to people. Okay? They knew about these contracts. Now, of course, not everyone was educated the same way, but they knew one thing: if you have such a contract, it's dependable. So if God makes such a contract with you, he is dependable, which is a radical different statement as with all the other religious systems. Okay, so that's quite different here. So even the structure itself speaks of the faithfulness and the character of God, which I think is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, especially in that time and area.
Sorry, almost.
All right, does that make sense here?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is going on besides that? Now, Deuteronomy 7 gives us the reason why they should enter the covenant. So I have picked out a few passages, of course not everything, but a few passages that I think are crucial for the understanding of Deuteronomy. So it states there, chapter 7, verse 7 and following, 7 to 9, because it was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you or chose you, for you were the fewest of all people when you started. You started with Abraham, which is 1. Okay. You cannot start very much lower. But it is because the Lord loves you. That's the foundation for the covenant. Okay, God's love. So his unmerited favor on their behalf is the condition for the covenant. Now, how can you mess that up?
Yeah.
You can hardly mess it up, but they managed. Okay. Now, and it is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. So he's saying, I made that promise, I stick to it. Even though you are hundreds of years later, it's still valid. Okay, so God is dependable here. The Lord has brought you with a mighty hand and redeemed, and so on, out of slavery from the hand of Pharaoh. Know that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. So now the other side is also included. You have to love him and keep his commandments, but the basic motivation comes from his side. Okay, so he is interested. That is the first thing. God is acting on their behalf. I think it's a very valid statement there. Second one would be from chapter 26, back in the book here. there we are on the demands, okay, in the contract, on the side where demands are made. The Lord your God commands you to do these statutes and rules. So, how do you do it? You shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. So, invest everything you can to put that into practice. You have declared today that the Lord is your God, and you will walk in his ways and keep his statutes and his commandments and his rules, and will obey his voice. So we have the commitment of the people, we have the declaration of the law, and we have the continual speaking of God. Not just contract, but also obey his voice. He will go on to speak to you, okay? So this is not a stiff paper and you can put it somewhere in a cupboard. It's a relationship. That's the issue here. And the Lord has declared today that you are a people for his treasured possession. So this is what they have to do. This is what he does. You are his treasured possession. He has promised you that you are to keep his commandments. So he's helping you. He will set you in praise and in fame and in honor high above all nations that he has made, that you shall be a people holy to the Lord as he promised. So we have the weaker parties' share and God's share, and that's a bit bigger than theirs, okay? So basically this is showing that there is a contract between a stronger and a weaker party here. Okay, now, how did they execute it? This is Shechem, this is Ramallah today, I think. What is it?
I don't know.
No, Nablus. Sorry, I just confused my geography. Sorry. This is Nablus today. And these are the two, I mean, I'm Swiss, so don't call that mountains. So these are the two hills that are, no Dutch here, huh? No, okay. Oh. Mountains, okay, they're mountains. Okay, so we have on the south we have Mount Gerizim, on the north we have Mount Ebal, and in the middle we have a valley, and it's like an arena, perfect. So what they did is some of the tribes, here's the list, they went on that hill, some on the other hill, and then they shouted chapter 28 of Deuteronomy over the people who were down there in the middle, and you could hear it. They may have used, you used wooden or leather funnels in order to project your voice. So they may have used that. We're not told about technical things, but they were existing and known by people. So they would speak it out and live it out. The people could experience the making of the covenant. Wow. And this is another element. This is where we I'm talking about the dry bone Reformed Christians. I'm part of that church, so I can say that. We lack of things with experience in our churches. We say the word only, which is theologically true, but not always livable. So experience is very important as well. Now the Catholics, which is the reaction of the Reformed against the Catholics, of course, they were a bit heavy into experience in some issues, and therefore there is this kind of extremes of positions. But basically, to experience something gives assurance and stability and certainty. They could say to their grandchildren, maybe born 50 years later, they could say, remember, when you look up the hill, these guys would speak out the curse of God from there. These guys would speak out the blessing of God. So you can re-experience it with the next generation. And this is always important, that you have things like this in your society where you can experience the things that are of high value, so it can be transferred to next generations. And this is also done here in Deuteronomy.
I've never seen.
Yeah, this is taking a picture from east through the valley. Okay. Yeah, we'll see. The map on the map is up here on the hills of Ephraim. Samaria is the area. Okay. All right, so this is experiential theology or experience theology, which is very important. Okay. So when we think about applying theological truth, we should always think as well on how can it be experienced and lived and felt and touched and so on. Very important. All right. Now, the term covenant, this is a technical one. There is one detail which is interesting, and that is that in Hebrew you don't say you make a covenant, you always say you cut a covenant. Because every covenant that you make is connected with a sacrifice.
Yeah.
And you have to cut the animal in order to make the sacrifice, and therefore you imply by saying, let's cut a covenant, that you will commit and bring a sacrifice for it, and then there is the assurance for it. So berit is the term, which is not so important, but the issue that you always link it with a sacrifice. So it's a ceremony and a celebration, and they would do the same. Again, experience. Okay.
Interesting.
Now, when we look at some further developments, I told you that in chapter, where were they? Chapter 4, there is a list of the cities of refuge.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now, interesting is when you put that on the map. Sometimes that's a fun part. So let's look at this here. 6 cities of refuge. The cities were there. This is the provision for the manslayer who by fleeing there may save his life. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally without having hated him in the past. So our term for that today is tragic accident. Okay. Now the description goes on. When you work in the woods and you use your axe and it falls off your shaft and flies into the other guy's head and he dies, this is where it applies. Okay, so it's unintentional, it's an accident. Now the normal procedure, again, in this time and territory, would be that the family who experienced the damage is allowed to give the damage back.
Yeah.
So go back, kill another guy. Okay. Now, this principle is still alive today, unfortunately, in some cultures. Okay, so I don't know the English term, bloedrache. Revenge by blood would be,
Revenge killing. Yeah.
revenge killing or so,
Revenge.
which is absolutely right in some cultures still. Okay, of course it's wrong, but culturally it still exists. So what God does is He gives a stop to that. He says, no, if something like that happens, don't take justification into your own hands, bring it to the people, judicial system, okay? Where? Galilee up here in Kadesh is a city. The next one is in Shechem, that is Ebal and Gerizim, okay? The next one is in Hebron in the south, down here. And then they had 3 more because they also had the territories in the east, which were in Bezer, trading route, the King's Highway, it's called, the major trading road there. Then in Ramoth Gilead, still on the same road. And then off that road, which is the cut from this side towards Damascus, Syria, you would come through that road. So all of these cities can be reached within a day from anywhere in Israel. Okay, which means the people who think that that applies to them, they can run. They have enough time, a day is enough. The city where they run to, these 6 cities, they have the obligation to take them in and to protect them until there is a normal judicial case, until it's dealt with by the elders of the city, and they can go back as soon as the king who was ruling dies. That's later development, but that's in Joshua. So when the king who was a king, when it happened, dies, then they are allowed to go back and they shall not be touched again. So 2 things, protection for the guy, proper judicial evaluation of the case, and then proper judgment. And a time frame for how long this separation could be if it doesn't work out. This is law, okay? And it's law in geography.
Yeah.
Okay, which is fun, I think.
Yeah.
So you see that God did not only provide the land for them and said, okay, go and do something, but He helped them to establish proper procedures, even in the worst case, if someone gets killed. Okay. which is quite interesting, not existing in other cultures, at least not in these territories. And of course, another part would be, where was the sanctuary? And that was at the beginning in Gilgal. Then they that was here with Moab still, with Moses. Then they crossed to Gilgal. It was in Shechem, where they called out the blessing and the curse. And then it was in Shiloh, which eventually was destroyed by the Philistines. So I'm not sure, do you see that green stuff there? Okay. It was in the Philistine territory for a while and then moved around there for another 20 years before it came back to Jerusalem, or was brought to Jerusalem. So the sanctuary was in the center. Okay, central place of worship. Okay, law of centralization. Okay, it was not one place, but at least one region. So you knew you could go to the high priest, you could bring your sacrifices. It was not everywhere, of course, and it took a few days to get here. I mean, that's a 4-day walk from the Sea of Galilee to Gilgal, for example, something like that. So it's an effort, but it's manageable. Now, one thing more that was interesting, and I did that recently with my other class in the bi-weekly course, was where were the cities of the Levites? I'm not sure if you ever looked them up on a map. That's fun. Okay, so the cities of the Levites are all these colored dots here. Depending on what family they belong to, it's a different color, okay? So in the north, we have a lot of cities of Levites, as you see, Galilee. In the middle, there is not much, because the sanctuary is there. You don't need a lot of cities of Levites. They always go there, do their duties, they go back to their villages. In the south, you have a lot of cities, again, central south areas. That's more another clan, that's why they are green. I'm not sure how you do with color, but you can see it. I'm partly colorblind, so I don't see that stuff well. So I see a bit of dots here. And this is where the sanctuary was moving around. So you would have a system where there is, simplified, always someone around who can teach you about the law. Okay? So the giving of the territories of the Levites was not, oh, those poor guys don't have any land because we don't have enough. The purpose was, you should be amongst the people and you should train them. You should teach the law, which we already read. So it is, again, theology and education done through geography, which I think is interesting. And then the people would need to help the Levites in their areas, okay? Because the Levites had some cities and a bit of land, but they couldn't have the big income, so they would have support by the surrounding people. Therefore, you would have dependable relationships again. So a lot of this technical stuff, now this is a jump a bit more into Joshua because he settled the details, but it was already stated that this should happen, and Joshua simply defined with God where that would be, okay, or by the lot, they threw the lot to figure it out. So God was giving them a system of worship, was giving them a system of education. There were no universities, education was related to God and learning about the law. And he gave them a judicial system of protection, and he involved Levites and elders into that system. So people who are not the big rulers somewhere, but they are part of the other people, okay? So it was on the lower end of society and not high society that controlled everything, which was different in other cultures. There was always the high society who had everything in control. Okay? Can I?
Yeah. Of what you said about it's not about high society being.
It is normal people. It's Levites. It is the elders of a city who may be, I don't know, I'm picking up a profession, a gardener or a sheep herdsman or whatever. Some people who were just normal people, but they had the function of being an elder, being a respected person in that community. And if there was a judicial case, they would be called in. So it was not an elite or a professionalized society, as we try and do it most of the time today, but it was on level with the people. And that makes it a bit random, that's true, depending on what kind of people you have, but it makes it also approachable. It's not cut off. I mean, we have a saying here in Switzerland, which you hear often when you go to a restaurant somewhere, and some people talk about politics. You are almost sure to hear the same, well, those in Bern, they always do what they want. They don't care about us. Separation between the political elite and the people. Now, whether that's true or not is another story. And in some respects it is true, in some it's not. But it's experienced with a distance. This was not the case here. It changed with the kingdom. Because then you got the professionals. Okay, so there was a bit of a problem with that. So you see with geography and with some of these places, you see that God was actually establishing means of help for them to have a proper society that could grow up. Where is my mouse? Is here. Okay, don't need that anymore. So Deuteronomy is, I think, a very interesting book. Okay, so what can we still learn? What is the basic law, or what would you describe as the basic law within Deuteronomy?
Remember God and keep his commandments.
Okay, so the Shema Israel, to love him and so on. Okay,
Yeah.
what groups of laws? Foundational? Because we have tons of them if we look at.
Blessings and the curses, or like more specific?
That would be more the application. How do you put it into practice? Yeah. Yeah, I'm not so sure if my question is asked the proper way. If you look at all these commandments, the question is which ones are foundational and which ones are building on the foundation of others.
Okay.
So which ones would you see as foundational?
I would say judicial commands
Okay.
are foundation, and the sacrifice. I think the first four,
If you look at this catalog, yeah.
and then the others are building.
Okay.
The Ten Commandments would be pretty foundational. Also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say this is the first statement of God to Israel through Moses, what they have to do. Okay, we have the 10 commandments. All the others basically build on that. Okay, so we have a foundational set of simple commandments, and I thought I'd like to look at them briefly. And the first thing is, and I'm warning now you guys in India, you will not be able to read it, but it doesn't matter because it's too small, okay? Where are you? You're there, okay, sorry for that. So let's see. This is the text of the 10 commandments grouped into each commandment in Deuteronomy. You can do the same with Exodus because it's a repetition with a couple of changes, but that's it. So we have the 10 commandments. If you count the stuff, you realize that it's 12 elements and not 10. So you have more and you have to make 10 out of it. That's the first challenge. Okay, so let's see what the people are doing. In the Jewish culture, that's down here, up to the time of Josephus, which is the early time of the New Testament, or New Testament time, we could say, they counted it with the title, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. That was their first commandment. We would not call that a commandment, okay? But they called it that way. You shall have no other gods, you shall not make yourself a carved image or so, is then the second commandment. And you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, because God will punish that. That would be the third one. So that's Jewish counting. At the end, they combine, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. nor desire your neighbor's house, field, and so on. They put that into one. And this is how they come up with 10. Okay. In the Reformed, Anglican, and Orthodox Church and Jewish culture after Josephus, which means after Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews were spread, they changed the counting. They said, this is the prologue or the title. I am the Lord your God, and so on. The first commandments then would be, you shall have no other gods. And then the rest is all similar like these here. So they changed the beginning. If you are Catholic, count differently. Because they took the prologue plus 1 and 2 into one commandment. And where the others had the third commandment, the Catholics and Lutheran Church have the second one. And in the end, they separate the coveting of the wife and the coveting of buildings and goods into two. Okay?
Just to be different.
The first challenge is, how do you want to count? And there is a history beside it and theological ideas, whatever. But it's interesting to know that when you speak of the fifth commandment, not everybody understands the same thing. Good to remember, okay? Depending whether your audience is Catholic or not. Okay, so basically this is the first thing. Now, what happens with these commandments? Let me summarize that. Is that readable now for
India?
Yeah?
Yeah.
It's good, okay. So I shortened them and put them into the list. And the thing on the left side is just how they count it, but you can basically forget that. That's not so important. So we have a set of commandments, we have the introduction, and that's what we have there. Now, what happens? The first 5 or 6 statements focus on God. I include honoring father and mother there because the promise is that God will give you rest when you do that. So the focus is still on God there. Okay, so the first set of commandments focuses on God. The second series focuses on man or on people. Okay, do honor father and mother. That is also relational. Do not murder, not commit adultery, not steal, and so on. That's relational, social commands. So we could say these are simplified religious, these are social. Okay, but both are within the 10 commandments, which means God is not only interested in religiosity, but also how you live it. Okay, social aspects as well, how you relate to others, not just how you relate to Him. Yep.
Could you say that they're all religious and social?
Of course, you can go there. Well, let me point out what happens when we go on. Okay. Now, most of them are negative. Keeping the Sabbath holy is partly positive, but you shall do no work on there is negative again, saying don't. Okay. The only one which is not negative, basically, is honor father and mother because God will honor you for that. That's the only one, which makes me thinking that that might be the turning point in the list of commands here, okay? Now, if we continue, we have 2 of them about the image and the misuse of the name of God with a warning, and we have 1 with a promise when you behave properly. Okay, so that's all technical aspects. But when I studied the text, and in SBS, you always have to do something with the text. So you always think, what do I do with the 10 commandments? Kind of, you never know. Then suddenly I realized that there is a development that is taking place, but in a wrong direction. Okay, let me explain. Honoring father and mother is good. If you go from there and think about honoring, you're saying, okay, I'm not honoring the day of God, the Sabbath. That's not so good. If you are misusing the name of God, you are not honoring His name. You're not honoring His day. You're not honoring His name. If you are making His image, you are not honoring Him as a God. Okay? And therefore, you end up with having another God beside Him. So there's development that is in increasing steps. Same happens down here. If you covet, it's happening in your brains normally. Start with, okay, you may discuss it with someone, but usually it's your own idea. whether it's wife or house, I took them together here, okay? So you covet. Now, when you covet, you tend to speak little of the other party. So you are speaking false accusations or statements about them. When you steal, you're turning from speaking to acting. When you steal things, you're not far from stealing people, adultery and so on. And eventually you may end up with murder, which is exactly what David did. So you have a process of what David did on the roof when he saw Bathsheba. Okay, so there is development. It starts very little, but it can develop into something very bad. So this progress is there in the law, but it is in the reverse order, interesting enough. I'm not sure why this happens. I'm still trying to figure this out, but I just noticed there is a pattern in there, okay? And the pattern ought to teach us not to start doing wrong with the little things and be faithful with the other things as well. Okay. Now, let's look at that again. So if we look at that, we are in the area of thinking, speaking, acting alone, acting together, and then destructive. Here we are in the area of speaking, acting, speaking to yourself, speaking together, destructive relationships. Same pattern. Okay? So it's like when you are not obeying God, it eventually will lead you into a destructive relationship, either with God or with people. Okay, so this is the process that we can see, and eventually the outcome will be death. Sin always leads to death. Now, this is a very black and white category, like all the prophets use. They don't know grayscales, they just know white or black. Okay, so you die. That's their protection. But it's not without reason, because it is a development that goes into that direction, and eventually that's what happens. And either it's a physical issue of killing, or it's a spiritual issue of destroying your relationship with God, and that makes it death as well, which is even worse. Okay? So we have both of these lines in the Ten Commandments. Now, interesting is, what was Jesus' answer to how to summarize the law? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself. Both elements are there in the Ten Commandments. So they are the groundwork, the layer upon which everything builds in the law. Okay, how to relate properly to God and how to relate properly to others. If we remove any of that, we're done. Okay, so in our societies today, we are trying to replace God with all sorts of other things, and I think it's just not working. Okay, we're excluding God from the picture, and we shouldn't do it. Okay, but of course, it's not easy to try and establish principles of God in a society that says there is no God. Okay, how do you want to do it? And anybody who is a Christian and involved in politics knows that this is terribly hard to do. Okay, and we have the same here in our village. We are trying. We are losing people in the church. Every Reformed church is doing that. And the major point is that people think, well, it's just not valid. It's not important anymore. So the question is, how can you show them that it is valid and it is important? Because there is a lot that happens, but you just don't notice it. So this is a big issue here. So how can you apply from here? Let me check about applying the law. I think I'll jump to that here. Should I do that? No, I go right here. Okay. The Torah is the first part of the Bible, and Joshua is instructed to read it, know it, meditate on it. Moses is instructed in the royal law that a king should have his own copy of the law, certified by a Levite and should read it regularly. So they should make it part of the governmental system. Some of them did, some of them didn't, and some rediscovered it, like Josiah was astonished. Oh, that's interesting. I should have known that. And he repents. Okay, so he reacts properly. So it should be done and it should be kept. And this is now out of Joshua, but it's basically what we have in the Torah, in Deuteronomy. So what are the things? Oh, sorry, that was not what I wanted.
This is how.
Well, okay, there are a few words that are used. I took the wrong passage here. Genesis. It's about obeying God's voice. Okay, sorry, I jumped too far. It's obeying the voice, keeping charge, commandments, statutes, and laws. If you look up the terms, it's interesting that God is trying to communicate on all levels. So it's hearing his voice, which means you are somehow related to him if you want to hear his voice. It's keeping his requirements, that would be the written stuff. It is the instructions of a father to a son, so listen to the previous generations, what they had to teach to you. It is the unchangeable ordinance and has to be kept, so the principles by which this world runs. And it is the Torah, which is teaching, instruction, and directive, basically. So all of this should be done and implied. So the law should be present in all spheres of learning in that sense. So that would be part of an educational system that should contain all of these elements. Now today, I know that it's not modern in our educational system in Switzerland that you want to listen to what previous generations thought was good. You always think about what we think now. So you exclude part of the learning process, the instructions of a father to a son. And of course, you make it even more difficult if a son cannot grow up with the father anymore because he's always in childcare and not at home anymore, and the fathers don't have time anyways. So all of this is corroborating the educational system, basically. So this would be part of it here. So when we have the Torah, meaning the instruction, that's the foundation. I want to show that. We have the prophets. They are using the foundation to teach others. And we have the writings which are reflecting on the teaching of prophets and of the law, basically, meditating and so on. And my summary is a very simple one, which helps you to remember it whenever you go into one of these shops here. I'm not sure whether they have them nearby in India, but something similar, I think. Okay, so the foundation is the law. Okay, on the foundation, you have the prophets, which are talking about how did you use it? How do you apply it? It's based on the law, okay? And you have the writings, which are then thinking about the law and how they did it, okay? So you are looking from a bigger perspective. How did they do? What can we learn? How can we become wise? This is the purpose of the writings. Okay, we see the law, we see how they did it. How can we now learn? Okay, reflect on it. So this is how the three parts of the Old Testament are connected. This is the Jewish arrangement of Scripture, not the Christian one. We have historical books and so on, but this is how they actually arrange Scripture. Okay, so the previous slide is Jewish arrangement of Scripture. So Daniel is not with the prophets. Daniel is with the writings, for example. Okay, so that should teach us something. Okay, so there is only one problem with that principle here, and that is it's definitely not fast food. It's slow food. Okay. So disadvantage here. Okay, yeah.
Can I, sorry, take a picture of just the last slide?
Sure.
Where it was grouping different.
Yeah. It's in the PowerPoint.
Is
So,
it in the PowerPoint?
yeah, you have it.
Beautiful. Follow along.
It is.
Yeah, it's all there. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So when we see that, this is how we can then think about learning and applying the law. What is the law affecting, and how can we actually use it? So the law may consist of individual commands. You shall not kill, you shall not steal, and so on. Very simple, obey it. Okay. It may be also a collection of the law. The 5/5 of the Torah means everything together. It may be scripture, it's a term for scripture as well, which means you should also look in the prophets and in the writings, what you can learn, and now it gets extensive. And today in Jewish culture, they limit it as Exodus 20, when they leave, until the end of Deuteronomy. So this is the Jewish view of the law. The other is introducing the law, and the rest is then, of course, prophets and writings and so on. Okay, so this is what we have. The prophets, they are applying the law in various situations. So what they are doing is they are listening to God, and they are looking at people. And then they are speaking into the situation. That is their function. The prophets have their social status in the society. They were not to be touched, even if they were not really comfortable. Not every king kept that. Sometimes they killed prophets. But in general, they could say what God told them without risk. Well, with not so much risk. Depending on the king, basically. So they are applying the law. The writings, they are reflecting about the law, meditating, and they try to use wisdom. Okay. Now, all of these groups had people who functioned. I didn't put that on a slide. I forgot it. So in the law, you have the teachers, but you also have the Levites who do the sacrificial stuff in the temple, and you have the priests. Okay, Levites and priests. Priests are more the spiritual guys, the Levites more the practical guys. Simplified. It's not true completely, but to get some idea. Now, the priest is basically beside the prophet, or parallel to the prophet, or the prophet to the priest. I said the prophet listens to God and looks to people. The priest listens to people and looks to God. The other way around. What is your problem? How can we go to God with that? That is his function. Okay, so it's the same procedure, but from the other direction. And then, of course, you have the scribes later on, but that starts after the exile, who are the teaching ones, who are trying to teach the law.
So I just want to make sure I don't get them mixed up. The prophets were go to the people and listen for God, and priests were the other way around?
They listen to the people. I have sinned, what can I do?
Right, that.
You go to the priest. Okay, right. You don't go to the prophet.
Yes, thank you.
The prophet says, oh, you're dead.
Yeah.
Not helpful. Okay, so these are God established functions within society that it could function related to him. Not that doesn't say that it did, but it could. Bless you. Okay, I go until 12:15. Okay, that's good. We'll work there. So let me just see. Now the challenge is what happens with the New Testament. Okay, Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill it. Now the point is, he was the ultimate expression of God's love. In the Old Testament, we just have the foundation of God's love and his actions, but then we have the complete expression of God's love. And if that is expressed, no law is needed anymore because it's simply already settled. Okay, you don't need it. You don't need to a regulation if somebody's committed that way. That basically is the idea here. So I jump a couple of slides here. So let me just see what I want to jump to. Yeah, let me do it this way. So when we think of the Old Testament related to the New, we have one passage which is crucial, and I think I didn't write it down here. No, I didn't. Yeah, so let me say it from the top of my head. Jesus said in a discussion with the Pharisees, that's John 5:39. Okay, he said, you are scribes, there was scribes of the Pharisees. You are searching scriptures as if you would have life in them. But it is me that they are speaking about. So Jesus said, scripture is not there to give you life. It is there to recognize who I am. That is the function of scripture. Now, Paul was basically saying the same thing in Galatians when he said the law is your custodian. That is, so that brings you to the teacher. The word he was using was pedagogos. The law is the pedagogos. We have pedagogue from it, and we immediately think it's the teacher. Wrong. The pedagogos was the slave in the rich family who brought the children to the teacher. So the law is not giving you the teaching, it's bringing you to the teaching. The function of the law is to point how it was fulfilled in Jesus. Okay? So God was working towards that all the time through Israel's history, pointing out how he will eventually fulfill the law. Yes?
That's amazing. What was the word?
Pedagogos. We have pens here. Which one work?
Everything.
Okay. Pedagogos. Hope you can read it over screen. Use the camera. Yeah, okay. So that is the definition of the slave that brings the kids to the teacher. Now that's a rich household, of course, because in poorer households they didn't have those guys. And of course, our teachers today, the pedagogue, is coming from that term, and that's why we sometimes think on the wrong track here. Okay, so the law function is to lead to the truth in Christ. Therefore, the Old Testament, in that sense, is a covenant, an agreement, yes, but it is not our testament anymore. Okay, it points to Christ. Now, it is a new covenant, which Jeremiah said in chapter 31, that is established in the hearts, that God will establish long after the law. Okay, so this is also clear. So the purposes of God, he is going towards them steadily. And therefore, many of the requirements of the Old Testament covenant are not renewed or affirmed, especially the ones about the sacrificial system. The cultic aspect of the law is not necessary anymore. That was the big discussion in Acts 15. Do the Gentiles who become Christians have to become Jews? Basically, circumcision and everything. Or is it enough to trust Christ? And the answer in the Council of Jerusalem was, it's enough to trust Christ. Okay. Only consider a few things that may be offensive to Jewish people, so don't do them. But that wasn't for salvation, that was for loving your neighbor, basically. Then the law is always God's word to us, but not always God's command to us. So if we look into the Old Testament, we can learn from it because it is God speaking. We learn about situations, about people, about God, but not everything in there is a command of God, okay, to us. Now, I skipped the passage here. So, and only what is renewed in the New Testament as a law or a regulation, or let's say by Christ, is also, as we would call it, the law of Christ, which is summarized in love. And that's very little. Okay, well, very little in terms of amount of words. Very big in terms of achievement. So the law is something we can use and learn and live by if we think about society. But it's always leading to a goal, and that is Christ. So whatever principles we derive from, let's say, Deuteronomy or Old Testament scriptures, they should implement also the fact that it's going somewhere, okay, or pointing somewhere, where the truth who God is can be established or stated or built up.
In relation to environment, what are your views about the laws of the land and kind of, every 7 years letting the land rest and farming, and in the 6th year, or is it the 5th year, I can't remember, but gather enough for the next year that you want. What do you think about that in relation to
we thought in all of our societies we can be much more efficient than that. We are reaping the harvest, to use the picture. It's not working. We are destroying ecosystems because we are overusing the land, and we are not giving it the rest, and so on. So there is a lot of wisdom and truth in that. Now, I lived in a farmhouse, okay, and we only lived there, we didn't farm, but our neighbor used all the stables and the barns, okay. And so he was one of these who was between the systems, maximum efficiency, but still simple farming because it's more beneficial in the long run. But we had a lot of discussions on that. And the problem is that for a long time, we had economic principles as the major drive. And that is more with less resources. Okay, gain more, do less. Now, in agriculture, this was a boomerang. It was actually destructive. So laws changed again, and therefore there was a principle where you are getting money if you are on the slow track and give the land some rest and so on. So we are somewhere there now. And in our system, it's mixed. In the EU, they are changing that as well. So we are constantly up and down. The worst thing was, he had pigs. Then the regulations, how you hold the pigs or raise them, changed, more efficiency. So he had to build a new barn for the pigs. He did that, lots of money. 5 years later, the regulations changed because they realized it's too intensive. So all these regulations that forced him to build the barn made it impossible, they changed them, to use the barn. So what he did was he moved the pigs into the farmhouse where we were with the old stables, which were not so efficient, but they met the criteria, which is absolutely stupid. And of course, it was very noisy at the morning at 6 o'clock when he feeds them. So, but the point is, we're constantly trying to adjust, and we're not using wisdom. And this is what should happen here. So how can wisdom come out of systems and stay there? I think this is one of the crucial things. Okay, let me point out one thing. If we look at the laws, we can group them very simply. Okay, you can do other groups. We can group them into civil laws, relational between people or society, ritual laws, temple worship oriented, and moral laws, attitudes and actions. Okay, that can be grouped this way. Okay, so when we look at them, I know there are other ways of categorizing it, so this is a very simple way. When we look at it, we have to ask the question, what is it for? How can we use it today? And there's a pattern that we could do, and that is, there is a message to the original hearer. We are in Deuteronomy. God spoke to Moses. Moses spoke to the people. Okay, there is a message. Some of it, all of it is for all of them. Okay, some of it is for their situation in their time. So for them, it is binding. For us, it might be relative because we are in a different situation at a different time. And some of it is absolute. Do not steal, do not murder, and so on, okay? So the question would be, if we have a law, a regulation, can we see what is relative, their situation, but not necessarily for ours, and what is absolute in it? In SBS, we have a famous term that we never use here on base, but we call it the timeless truth. I'm not sure if you heard that, but this would be the idea. What is still there that should be done with it? And what of it can be kind of dropped off because it's out of their time. Okay. So you bring the absolute out of this process. You know now what is absolute, and then you can think about how can I now communicate this to ourselves and to the people around us. We should always start with ourselves. So how can we bring it to the target group? Let's take a ceremonial law here. It regulates the procedure how you can relate to God. Now, if we look at this message to the original hearer, there is a bronze basin in the temple. The priests, or in the tabernacle, the priests have to wash themselves before they do a sacrifice or before they go into the tabernacle. So it's purification, ritual washing. Now, the message is you shall put this bronze basin there between the tabernacle and the altar. Okay. Second, the high priest and the priests wash their hands and feet before they enter, typing error, the tabernacle or before they bring an offering. Okay. So they are doing that. Then the washing is necessary to cleanse them ritually, to do away with ritual uncleanness outside. Okay, they are clean. It's a ritual. Now they are able to perform their duty. And this ritual symbolizes the purity that they must have in order to be able to bring a sacrifice, or in other words, in order to be able to meet God. Okay, this is the proper procedure. So they had the tabernacle, they had to do this step by step, no distinction. Now, after the destruction of Jerusalem, temple gone away, this is not really practical because it's just not existing anymore. Okay, so what can we learn from it? What is relative to their setting? And that, of course, is the individual procedure in the tabernacle or temple. And what is absolute, which would probably address the issues of purity. Okay, so tabernacle was a shadow of the coming sanctuary of Christ. This is what Hebrews says. Hebrews is great for understanding the law. It's just pointing to the real sanctuary which is in heaven and made visible through Christ. Secondly, Jesus is the high priest who has given himself. So all believers are cleansed and have free access to God if they accept this. Okay, so no washing needed and so on, but accepting it and trusting God is enough. And thirdly, the believers are cleansed inside through the blood of Christ. Okay, so it's the inside. The law is now in the heart, which we had in Jeremiah 31, through the sacrifice of Jesus. And the purity through Christ is characterizing the whole life, of the believer. So it's not just an action, I have to go to the temple and do something, but it's a whole lifestyle. This would be what we can learn practically today about ceremonial law. Okay. Now, of course, there are other laws that can be done. I have a couple of examples in the notes. Ceremonial, civil and moral. I have a couple of examples there doing the same process, basically. So the question is always, when you want to use passages, first decide what is for them only and has changed over time, what is for even later times, and then you can think about how could this be applied or implied. Okay. I think that's basically what I wanted to do on Deuteronomy. Is there anything more? Oh, you had these social structures already, I think. There is nothing new about that. So this is, I use 8 groups here. Others are 7. Some use more, whatever. Okay. So don't worry. Whenever I prepare a teaching and 2 years later I do the same teaching, they have changed again. So I don't care about it. It's my version and I leave it this way. But the point is that what is important, what we learn is that God should be at the center of all of these areas of life and should influence, therefore, the decision making. And the decision making today, of course, is done in different ways. Christians say, with the God of the Bible. non-Christians either say there is no God, so their decisions are quite different, and others say, well, there are many gods. We find truth in this and in Buddhism and in whatever else, or animism or whatever. So you come up with totally different solutions. So the first question that always has to be settled is, who is God? Once this is settled, this defines everything else. Okay, so, and I think this is important to keep in mind. All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you?
I'm done. I think that's it. I don't go into details here, but you have your tools and you will work on it anyways this afternoon. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you heard Heinz. He has a lot of wisdom, and I mean squeezing him and covering a whole book, and one of the longest book anyway. Almost in 2 hours. It's hard for him because he loves to go in every detail, but he did it. And
What's your favorite book in the Bible to teach?
I'll say
Okay.
there are really many. Yeah. So.
so I mean,
but we can have a coffee together and talk about it.
I mean, he's around, and you can approach him. And if you have questions, then this would be the right man, not just about this book, but about any other books. And yeah, this afternoon we will have then the assignment. So do you want to give a short 1, 2, 3 feedback to Heinz, what you appreciate and what you take with you?
You lived up to introduction. Yeah, really great teaching. The fact that you went through a very rocky stuff.
Yeah.
So much clearer. Yeah, I love your slide.